Oren asked me Thursday morning if I wanted him to come. I said no. I said this one was mine. He handed me a travel mug of coffee and said, "Come home with the whole story." He said it the way you say something when you already know how it ends and you just want to hear it told. The drive to the city was 2 hours. I left early. I took the route that goes past the edge of Del Ridge, past the county road that turns off toward the old farmhouse, past the gravel pullout where Grandpa Victor used to park his truck when he wanted to walk down to the creek. I slowed but didn't stop. I kept driving. The offices of Holt and Brierly were on the fourth floor of a building that was trying to look more significant than it was, the kind of building with a lobby fountain that has been broken for so long, nobody remembers it ever worked. The receptionist looked at me the way receptionists in lawyers' offices sometimes look at you when they've been told a version of who you are before you arrived. Professionally pleasant. Slightly predetermined. She offered me water. I declined. I sat in a chair and opened my bag and checked my folder one last time. Certified copy of the covenant. County filing receipt. Miss Okafor's contact card with her direct number written in ink. Grandpa Victor's letter in a clear protective sleeve. Everything accounted for. Then the door at the end of the hall opened and Mr. Brierly appeared. Mid-50s, silver watch. The particular posture of a man who has built his professional confidence on the assumption that the people sitting across from him haven't read the documents as carefully as he has. He smiled and gestured toward the conference room. I stood and followed him in. And sitting at the far end of the conference table, hands folded, in the pressed blue shirt he wore to events that required him to look reasonable, was my father. Randall looked up when I walked in. Same jaw. Same posture. Same slight tilt of the head that meant he had already decided how this meeting was going to go. "Hello, Selah." His voice was warm, controlled, calibrated to land somewhere between concerned father and reasonable adult. The tone that had disarmed me for decades. I stopped just inside the door and looked at Brierly. "I was told this was a meeting with your office." Brierly straightened. Mr. Voss asked to be present. He thought it might help move things along. Help move things along. I sat down across from my father, set my bag on the chair beside me, placed the folder on the table, didn't open it. Randall leaned forward slightly. The way he leaned forward in business meetings when he wanted to signal cooperative energy and retain control simultaneously. "Selah, I know we haven't talked in a while. This is complicated for all of us. But this is about Grandpa Victor's property. A simple transaction. He'd want us to handle it together." He used Grandpa Victor's name. The man who walked me across the grass at my wedding and whispered that I'd picked a good one. He said his name in a conference room the first time he'd been in the same space as me in 3 years and used it to try to move me. My hand rested on the folder, and I felt the conversation arrive at the moment I had prepared for, not with anger, with facts. Randall shifted into what I had come to think of as bank mode. The same voice he used to explain terms to people who hadn't read the fine print. "The parcel's been sitting empty," he said. "Nobody's using it. I've got a developer interested. It's a fair price. This solves things." He slid the quitclaim deed across the table. Same document as the one in the mail. Same signature line. Same deadline, now recalculated to account for the meeting. I picked it up and read it slowly, top to bottom. Every clause. Brierly watched me read it. My father tapped his index finger against the table. A rhythm I knew from childhood, the one he made when he was certain of an outcome and mildly impatient for it to arrive. I set the document down. "In 3 years," I said, "this is the first contact I've received from you. Through a law firm. A document. A deadline." He blinked. "Page, weave. Selah. My name is Selah." He paused. "We've tried to reach you," he said. "My number hasn't changed since the day I left your house." "That's not accurate," he said, turning slightly toward Brierly. "She cut off contact entirely. No explanation. She's been going through a difficult period. And Oren," he dropped his voice slightly, "has been a bit isolating as an influence. We're concerned about her environment. If this story is already making you feel something, if you've ever sat in a room and watched someone describe your life incorrectly to a witness, hit that like button. You don't have to say anything. Just let me know you're there." Brierly was writing on his legal pad. My father continued. "The family has been very worried. This isn't about taking anything from you, it's about doing what's practical. Victor didn't use that land. You don't use that land. The developer would put it to good use. He smiled, a small, reasonable smile. The smile of a man who has been telling a story so long he has forgotten it isn't the whole story. Are you done? I said. He stopped. The smile didn't disappear. It paused, the way a video pauses when the connection drops, there, but not moving. I reached into my folder and pulled out the certified copy of the covenant. I placed it face up on the table between us. This is a declaration of beneficial interest and restrictive covenant filed with Delridge County 8 years ago by Victor Aldous Harmon regarding the parcel referenced in your quitclaim deed. I pushed it toward Brierly because Brierly was the one in the room whose job required him to read it. My father looked at it without touching it, the way people look at things they haven't decided whether to acknowledge yet. Brierly picked it up. He read the first page. Turned to the second. His expression did not change dramatically. This is the particular skill of attorneys who have been practicing long enough to understand that expressions are data. But the pen in his hand stopped moving. He read the covenant clause. Read it again. Then he set the document down with the same careful deliberateness as you might set something down when you've realized it is more load-bearing than it appeared. He looked at my father. Mr. Voss, were you aware that your father-in-law had filed a restrictive covenant against this parcel prior to his death? Randall's head tilted. A what? Brierly picked up the document again and located the key clause. He read it aloud in the measured voice of a man reading someone else's bad news to them. The covenant restricts any compelled transfer of the named parcel by any party, including the beneficiary's immediate family, and specifically addresses legal attempts to compel such transfer. His voice slowed at the end of that sentence. He set the document down. That's not real, my father said. Victor never mentioned. Brierly was already reading the county filing stamp. This was recorded 8 years ago. The original would be on file with the county land registry. If this is accurate, Mr. Voss, and the filing appears to be in order, it would materially affect the viability of the transaction you've described. My father shook his head. He wouldn't do that. Victor loved this family. He would never go behind our backs like that. I held his gaze. He didn't go behind your back. I said it the same way Grandpa Victor would have said it, without heat, just precision. He protected his granddaughter. There's a difference. The conference room was very quiet. The heating system made a sound. Somewhere outside, traffic moved. Brierly dialed the number on Miss Okafor's card, put it on speaker. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was steady and unhurried. The voice of a woman who had drafted a document 8 years ago, knowing this call was coming. Brierly identified himself, stated the purpose of the call, and asked her to confirm the covenant. She confirmed everything. Filing date. Language. Intent. Enforceability. She said. Victor was very clear about what he wanted the document to achieve. He told me someone might contest it eventually and asked me to make sure it would hold. Brierly thanked her and ended the call. Then he looked at my father. Not unkindly, but without the protective layer of professional distance he'd maintained for the first 20 minutes of the meeting. Mr. Voss, the quitclaim deed I prepared for this meeting is not applicable under these circumstances. Miss Voss cannot be compelled to transfer this property. The covenant would need to be challenged through a lengthy legal process, and given the specificity of its language, I would not advise it. My father's mouth opened. Closed. His neck had gone red from the collar upward. That's my family's land, he said. Victor meant for it to stay in the family. She's family. Brierly was very still. She is. And her grandfather left it to her, with specific legal protection. And then my father said it. The thing he always said. The fallback. The final card in the deck when every other card had been played. He leaned forward and his voice dropped into the register he used when he wanted you to know he was serious. If you won't sign, I'll take legal action. I'll find a way through this. He said it the way he'd always said every ultimatum. Like consequence was something he invented. He turned to Brierly. Can't we challenge the covenant? Brierly adjusted his tie. You could attempt a legal challenge. But the covenant language is tight. It would be expensive, time-consuming, and based on what I'm reading. He paused. Unlikely to succeed. My father sat back. His hands, which had been cutting the air with certainty for 40 minutes, lay flat on the table. Then his phone buzzed. He glanced at it. Held up a finger. 1 second. He answered. The room was quiet enough that Colton's voice came through the phone speaker without needing to be amplified. Did she sign? We need to know by end of week. The landscaping contract falls through if we can't show the bank the land is an asset, Dad. Randall pressed his hand over the phone. I'm handling it. But Colton's voice continued. Just tell her it's what Grandpa Victor would have wanted. It always worked before. The sentence landed in the center of the table like something thrown from a great height. Randall pulled the phone from his ear and ended the call. His face had gone the color of old concrete. Brierly was looking at his legal pad. I looked at my father. It always worked before. I repeated it. Not loudly. Not with satisfaction. Just as a fact being named in a room where it had been operating unnamed for 30 years. My father's composure, that careful, constructed, lifelong composure, slipped. Not all the way. Just enough. Just enough for me to see underneath it the thing I had always half suspected was there. Not malice, but fear. Not calculation, but panic. He was a man who had organized his family the way he organized a business, efficient, hierarchical, unsentimental. And it had worked, or seemed to work, until the one person he'd allocated as low maintenance had quietly accumulated 30 years of being underestimated by someone who loved her anyway, and had left her something no one could take. I've invested everything in your brother's company, Randall said. His voice was different now. Unguarded in a way I'd never heard from him. We leveraged the house. Your mother and I, we co-signed loans. If the company can't use that parcel as collateral, the bank won't extend the line of credit, and if the line of credit doesn't extend, he stopped. This is bigger than some piece of land, Selah. This is our retirement. I looked at my father. The man who had called my husband a government worker with no equity. The man who had told 3 years of family members that I was unstable and isolated and possibly in crisis. The man who had sent a lawyer with a deadline instead of a phone call with an apology. The man who was now sitting across from me telling me that the financial security he had gambled on his son's business required a signature I was not going to give. You leveraged your retirement on Colton's company, I said. You co-signed his loans. You put your house up for him. And in all of that time, all of those decisions, all of those years, you never once called to ask how I was. He didn't answer. There was nothing to answer. The math was sitting in the room with us, visible and undeniable, the same way the covenant document was sitting in the room with us, visible and undeniable. Brierly stood. He had the careful posture of a man who has decided that the fastest route to not being involved in this any further is to professionally conclude the meeting. I think we should adjourn, he said. Mr. Voss, I'd recommend consulting with a trust and property attorney about your options regarding the covenant. Miss Voss, you are free to go. He said it with the particular gentleness of someone extending a door to the person in the room who doesn't need to stay. I collected my documents, placed them back in the folder, clipped it shut. The quitclaim deed sat in the center of the table, unsigned, like a question nobody had asked correctly. Selah. One word. My father said it the way you say something when you've run out of everything else. I stopped at the door. Please. Stripped of strategy. Stripped of cadence. Just a man in a room where the architecture of his authority had been quietly, legally, permanently removed by the person he'd decided didn't need protecting. I looked at him for a long moment. I saw the man who used to drive me to early morning cross-country practice before I was old enough to drive myself. Who once stayed up past midnight helping me memorize the periodic table for a test I was terrified of. Who had made choices, year after year, that arranged the family around someone else and allocated me into the category of capable enough to manage without. Who had told a story about me for 3 years because the alternative was acknowledging that the story was about him. He looked smaller than I'd expected. Not diminished the way cruelty makes people small. Diminished the way consequences make people small when consequences arrive. You have my number, I said. It hasn't changed. And I walked out. I sat in the parking garage for 10 minutes with the engine off. I didn't feel the way I'd expected to feel. Not victorious. Not even relieved. Not exactly. I felt something quieter. The specific exhaustion of a long effort finally finished. The kind of tired that means the work is done. Not that something went wrong. I drove home through the November gray, through 2 hours of Bear Tree Highway and radio static and Fee's dog hair on the passenger seat. And when I pulled into the driveway, Oren was on the porch with 2 cups of coffee and that expression he has when he's been waiting patiently and is trying to look like he hasn't been. I sat down beside him, handed him the folder. He read the covenant document in silence. When he finished, he handed it back and said, Victor. Just the name. Just that. And I nodded because there was nothing to add. It didn't end there, of course. These things never end at the conference table. Within a week, my mother called. Not my father. My mother, which surprised me. because in 34 years she had positioned herself as the emotional satellite to my father's son, the one who relayed feeling without generating it independently. She called on a Sunday morning, my Sunday, the one that used to belong to Grandpa Victor. She was crying, or something close enough to it that the distinction didn't matter. She said my father hadn't slept, that Colton's company was in serious trouble, that they were going to lose the house, that she didn't understand how things had gotten so far from where they were supposed to be. I sat on the porch with Fee's head on my foot and listened to all of it. I let her finish. And then I said, Mom, when did you last ask me how I was? A pause so long, I thought the call had dropped. I don't mean today, I said. I mean ever. In the last 10 years. When did you ask? She didn't answer. Not because she was being cruel, but because the question had a shape she couldn't fit into any response she'd prepared. I said, I'm not calling from a place of anger. I'm calling from a place of needing you to understand what the last few years have felt like. Not because you owe me. I'm past needing that. But because if you want there to be anything left between us, it has to start with that question. With actually asking it and actually meaning it. She said, I'll try to understand. It wasn't much, but it was the first honest thing she'd said to me in years. The financial reality arrived for my family, the way financial reality always does. Not all at once, but in stages, each one quieter and heavier than the last. Without the land as collateral, Colton's company couldn't extend its credit line. Without the extension, 2 pending contracts had to be declined. Without the contracts, 2 employees were let go. Colton restructured, downscaled. The version of the business that had been built on borrowed momentum and co-signed optimism became something smaller, harder, more honest. I didn't hear this from Colton directly. I heard it from Donnie, who had stayed connected to both sides of the divide and had the particular grace of someone who understands that loyalty isn't a fixed position. She told me something else too. Your dad asked Donnie to pass something along. He didn't ask her to tell me he was sorry. He didn't ask her to request anything. He asked her to tell me that he'd found an old photo from my cross-country state qualifier. He'd been there. Not 20 minutes late, not distracted by a phone call. He'd been there the whole time in the back of the crowd in a gray jacket, standing behind a tall family he didn't know. He hadn't come to my section because he thought I'd see him and feel the pressure. He watched the whole race from the back and drove home before I finished talking to my coach. He never told anyone. He told Danny now, 20 years later, in a conversation she described as the most uncomfortable and most honest she'd ever had with him. I sat with that for a long time. Not because it changed the accounting. It didn't. Not the bus passes, not the graduation, not the 3 years of silence, not the lawyers and the letters and the story about mental health incidents told in church parking lots. But because it added something to the picture I'd carried for so long. A shadow in the background of a crowd. A man who was there just not capable of being there correctly. I don't know what to do with that yet. I don't think I have to know right now. There were other calls. Aunt Teresa, the one who'd spread the mental health story to half the family, called to say she'd heard things from Danny and from Briarly's receptionist, who was apparently her neighbor, and that she was sorry for the role she played in the narrative my parents had constructed. Her apology was earnest and slightly rehearsed and completely sincere. I accepted it. Not because it erased the years of being described as unstable at Easter dinners. I wasn't invited to, but because she was genuinely trying and because Grandpa Victor would have said something kind about her, and I trusted his character judgment more than my own. 2 cousins texted. 1 didn't. That's the ratio you get, usually. Not everyone comes around. Some people are comfortable where they're standing even when the standing place is wrong. I didn't post anything. I didn't send an email. I didn't write a statement or a thread or a note to the extended family explaining what had happened and why. I just kept living. Work. Fee. Oren. The garden losing to the deer. Sunday mornings. The particular quality of November light on the kitchen table. In January, Oren and I drove to Delridge. I hadn't been back since the funeral. We turned off the county road onto the gravel track that runs along the edge of the old farmhouse property and kept going to the 4 acres with the creek. We parked at the edge of it. Walked in through the trees. The creek was running clear and cold, stones pale in the winter light. The woods on either side were bare and honest. The land was nothing dramatic. No view, no vista, no particular feature that would make it valuable to anyone who needed something from it. It was just 4 acres of quiet. It was just the thing Grandpa Victor had decided to stand between me and everything that would have taken it. We stood at the creek for a long time. Fee waded in immediately, objected to the cold, waded in again. Oren put his arm around me. I thought about an 81-year-old man sitting across a desk from his attorney and describing the family he loved and the granddaughter he worried for, and asking for the specific legal language that would protect her in a future he wouldn't be alive to navigate. I thought about the 8 years the covenant had sat in a county filing cabinet, patient and silent, waiting for the moment someone tried to undo it. He built a wall around me with paper and stamps and legal descriptions of acreage. Not because I asked him to, because he paid attention. Because he watched for 20 years and saw what my parents couldn't or wouldn't and decided that seeing wasn't enough, that something structural had to follow the seeing. He left me 4 acres and an instruction to laugh. I stood at his creek in January and did both. In March, I wrote a letter. By hand at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd opened the attorney's envelope 4 months earlier. I wrote it to my parents. Both of them. I didn't have anyone proofread it. I didn't ask Oren for edits. I wrote it the way you write something when you're finally not performing for anyone. I told them I was not interested in relitigating every year. That I had held the accounting long enough, and it was heavy, and I was putting some of it down. I told them the land was mine, and would remain mine not because I wanted to punish them, but because Grandpa Victor had decided it and I intended to honor that. I told them that if there was going to be a relationship between us, it had to be built on something different than what we'd had. Which was not closeness, not honesty, just the shape of closeness and the script of honesty performed in front of other people. I told them my door was open. Conditionally. Not as a doormat. Not as a budget line item that could be trimmed without consequence. But as their daughter, who had figured things out not because she didn't need help but because help was never offered, and who had survived that and was still here and was still willing to try if they were. I addressed the envelope. Stamped it. Drove to the post office on a Wednesday morning and mailed it. I didn't wait at the mailbox. I drove home and made coffee and let Fee out into the yard and watched her terrorize the deer and went back to work on a wetlands filing that needed to be submitted by Friday. 2 weeks later, a card arrived. Greeting card envelope, my mother's handwriting on the front. I opened it at the kitchen table. Inside was a blank card. Not a pre-printed message, just white cardstock with a painting of a winter tree on the front. In my mother's handwriting, 6 lines. No opening. No closing. Just the middle. I've been thinking about what you asked. About the last time I asked how you were, and meaning it. I don't have a good answer. I want to try to have one. We're not good at this. Your father and I. You know that. But we're trying to learn it. I just wanted you to know we read your letter. We read it more than once. I read it standing at the counter. Then I put it in the same drawer where I keep Grandpa Victor's envelope, the one that lived in my coat pocket for 14 months. The one that said open when you need a reason to laugh. They're in there together now, 2 pieces of paper from opposite ends of the same story. I don't know what comes next. I know what I want. I want parents who ask how I am and mean it. I want a brother who understands that family isn't a financial instrument. I want Christmases that don't feel like negotiations. I want to be someone's daughter in the full sense of the word. Visible, valued, not because I'm useful, but because I'm there. I want what Grandpa Victor gave me every Sunday on the phone: attention. Honesty. The specific and irreplaceable feeling of being someone's first thought instead of their afterthought. I don't know if I'll get it. I know I deserve it. That's the difference. That's what 3 years of silence and a 4-acre parcel in Delridge County and an envelope opened 14 months late taught me. You already have what you're worth. Nobody allocates that for you. It was already yours. They just didn't have the paperwork. On a Friday in April, I drove to Delridge alone. The spring had come to the creek, green visible in the brush along the banks, the birches just starting. I brought a thermos of coffee and Grandpa Victor's old field notebook, the one Miss Okafor had held back from the estate distribution because she said he'd specifically asked her to make sure I got it. On the first page, in his left slanted handwriting, notes on the land. Started it for Sela. She'll know what to do with it. I sat at the creek for 2 hours. I watched the water. I wrote 3 pages of nothing important. The dog hair on my coat, the way the light came through the birches, the specific stillness of a place that has been protected and doesn't know it and doesn't need to. I talked to him, the way you talk to people who left the room but never really left. I said, I found the document. I found the letter. I laughed, the way you told me to. He answered the way he always did. In the direction the creek ran, in the quality of the light, in the fact that the land was still there, and the covenant was still filed, and the 4 acres with the creek were still without question, entirely, legally, and permanently mine. My name is Scylla Voss. I'm 34 years old. 3 years ago, my parents' lawyer mailed me one document. That document didn't give me anything I didn't already have. It just reminded me that someone had already decided I was worth protecting, and that the paper agreed. If you stayed here until the end, thank you. I mean it more than the word usually carries. This story isn't about winning. It isn't about what I walked away from. It's about what was already there, waiting in a county filing cabinet, sealed in an envelope in a coat pocket, signed 8 years before anyone knew it would matter. It's about one person paying close enough attention to build something durable out of that attention. Most of us will not get that. Most of us have to build it ourselves. But if you're standing somewhere right now feeling like the low-maintenance one, the strong one, the one who figures it out and doesn't need the net, I want you to know something. Grandpa Victor didn't protect me because I was weak. He protected me because he paid attention. And you deserve someone who pays attention. So here's what I want to leave you with. If you could write one letter, one honest letter, to the person in your life who underestimated you the most, what would the first line be? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story found you at the right moment, I'd be glad if you hit subscribe. There are more stories where this one came from, and I'll be here with the next one when you need it. Take care of yourself. You already know how. My name is Scylla Voss, and I'm 34 years old. 3 years ago, I sat cross-legged on the floor of my apartment, surrounded by moving boxes I hadn't finished unpacking, and read a single document that a stranger's law firm had mailed to me. I read it once. Then I read it again. Then I laughed so hard my neighbor knocked on the wall to check if I was okay. Not because it was funny. Because it was the most perfectly written proof I'd ever seen that the people who were supposed to know me best had never known me at all. My parents hadn't spoken to me in 3 years. Not a voicemail. Not a forwarded birthday message. Not a single emoji on a holiday post. Then their attorney mailed me one piece of paper, and that piece of paper accidentally handed me the most important thing my family never gave me in 34 years of trying. Before I tell you what was in that document, I need to take you back to the beginning. Because if I just tell you the ending, you won't understand why I laughed. You won't understand what it cost me to get to that kitchen floor. And you won't understand what Grandpa Victor had been doing quietly, patiently, for years, building a wall around me that I didn't even know existed until the moment someone walked straight into it. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I grew up in a small city in Central Oregon, the kind of place where the mountains are always visible on a clear day, and everyone knows your car by the sound of the engine. My father, Randall Voss, owned a mid-sized landscaping company that had grown from a pickup truck and a handshake into something with actual invoices and seasonal contracts. My mother, Gloria, taught 3rd grade at the elementary school 2 blocks from our house for 22 years. From the outside, we were the kind of family that showed up to community events and remembered everyone's names. My parents were liked. They were present. They were by every visible metric, good people. And then there was my brother, Colton. 3 years older than me, Colton existed in our household the way weather exists. Not because he demanded it, but because everything else arranged itself around him. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't loud. He was simply the center of every room he entered, and my parents had decided that was true before he was old enough to prove it. Colton played baseball in high school. My parents drove 4 hours to every away game. I ran cross-country, and my mother once showed up to my state qualifier 20 minutes late, still in her school clothes, distracted by a phone call she hadn't finished. She cheered for the wrong runner. I didn't correct her. I want to be careful here, because the story I'm telling you isn't about me being a victim. It's about something more subtle than that. More patient. More quiet. It's about the kind of damage that doesn't leave marks because it never actually strikes you. It just redirects everything slightly away from you, year after year, until you realize you've been standing outside a window, watching a life that was supposed to include you, and you can't quite figure out when the glass went up. My father had a phrase. Whenever I mention the imbalance, the car Colton got at 16 versus the bus pass I received at 17, the business loan my father offered to co-sign for Colton's landscaping side venture before Colton was even 25, the way family dinners always somehow looped back to Colton's projects, his plans, his potential. My father would set down whatever was in his hand and look at me with something that was almost patience and say, "Scylla, your brother needs more guidance. You've always figured things out. That's what I admire about you." I believed him. I wore it like a compliment for years. I wore it so long it started to feel like identity. I was the one who figured things out. The one who didn't need the net because she never fell. It took me until my late 20s to understand that what he was actually saying was, "You cost less. Keep it that way." I put myself through college on a combination of scholarships, part-time work at a print shop, and a small grant I applied for 3 times before I was awarded it. I studied environmental law. Not the flashy side of it, not the courtroom drama version, but policy work, regulatory compliance, the kind of unglamorous labor that changes things slowly and permanently. I graduated with honors. My parents came to the ceremony. My mother took one photo on a disposable camera and later told me she wasn't sure if it came out. My father shook my hand like I was a new employee. Grandpa Victor, my mother's father, stood at the back of the crowd with a handwritten sign that said SELAWYERFTHECENTURY in red marker, even though I wasn't technically a lawyer yet, and cried openly in a way that embarrassed everyone except me. Grandpa Victor was the constant, the fixed point, the person in my life who never needed to be managed or interpreted or decoded. He lived alone in a farmhouse outside a small town called Delridge, about 2 hours from where I grew up, and he'd been widowed since I was 4. He kept bees. He built furniture badly but enthusiastically. He had a wood stove and a dog named Pepper and an opinion about everything, and a way of listening to you that made you feel like whatever you were saying was the most important thing anyone had said all week. I called him every Sunday. I drove to Delridge every few months. When things got hard, he was the voice I reached for, the one that answered with the right kind of quiet. When I was 27, I met a man named Oren at a policy conference in Portland. He was presenting research on wetland legislation. He had ink on his collar and strong opinions about federal overreach, and he brought me terrible gas station coffee on our second date because the espresso machine at the cafe we'd planned to meet at was broken, and he didn't want to cancel. We got married 2 years later in a small outdoor ceremony at Grandpa Victor's farm. Daisies in mason jars, string lights in the oak tree. Grandpa Victor walked me across the grass and whispered, "You picked a good one. He argues with you." He meant it as the highest compliment. My family came to the wedding, briefly. At a dinner the following month, my father looked at Oren across the table and said, with the kind of calm that makes you question whether sound actually traveled through the air correctly, "Environmental policy. So more of a government job. Nothing you can build equity in." My mother pressed her lips together and reached for the breadbasket. Colton glanced at his phone. Oren looked at my father for a long, level second and then said, "I've built enough." My father smiled the smile of a man who has dismissed something and moved on internally while still technically sitting in the room. On the drive home, Oren said, "Your dad has a way of delivering insults that are structured like observations." I said, "I know." He said, "How long has that been happening?" I said, "Since I was old enough to have opinions he didn't share." The break didn't happen all at once. It rarely does. It happened in layers. The way a wall doesn't collapse the moment it cracks. It cracks, and you fill the crack, and it cracks again somewhere else, and you fill that one too. And eventually, you are more filler than wall, and you realize the structure has already failed. You're just the last one to admit it. The moment that made me admit it happened at Thanksgiving. Colton had asked me, for the second time in 18 months, to invest in his landscaping business. His father's business, the one he'd been handed, rebranded, and expanded on the back of equipment my parents had purchased. He needed $18,000 for a new fleet vehicle. He'd already asked Oren and me the previous spring. We'd said no. I said no again, clearly and without apology. Colton went quiet in a way that meant that the conversation wasn't over, just transferred. After dinner, my mother found me in the kitchen. She stood in the doorway with her arms folded and her voice very low and said, "Selah, your brother is trying to grow something. The least you could do is support him." I told her I did support him. I just wasn't going to fund him. She said, "You know, ever since you married Oren, you've become very rigid." She said the word like it was a diagnosis. My father appeared in the hallway behind her, not accidentally. "She's right," he said. "You've changed. I don't know what it is, but something's different about you. And not in a good way." I looked at both of them. I thought about the graduation photo that never came out. I thought about the bus pass and the cross-country meet and the handshake at the ceremony. I thought about 20 years of being the low-maintenance daughter who figured things out and cost less and never needed the net. And I said, very quietly, I know what's different. I stopped pretending. I put my coat on and walked out. And that was the last time I spoke to my parents for 3 years. Silence, it turns out, is not what people tell you it is. People say things like, you must feel so free, or I bet that's a relief, and they mean well, but they don't understand the specific texture of it. The silence isn't empty. It's full. It's full of the story they're telling everyone else while you're not in the room to correct it. And they told a story. Within a month, Oren and I were getting calls from relatives. My cousin Donnie called first. She said my mother had mentioned to her that Oren had been controlling, and that I was struggling. That I'd pulled away from the family because he didn't want me to have relationships outside of our marriage. My father had called my Aunt Teresa and told her that I'd had, and I want to be precise here because precision matters, a mental health incident at Thanksgiving. That's what he called it. A mental health incident. Because I said no to a loan and walked out of a dinner. Aunt Teresa relayed this to 3 other relatives before the week was out. The story traveled the way those stories always travel, through the parts of the network that love drama and distrust silence. And by the time it made 3 full loops, Oren was controlling, I was unstable, and my parents were suffering quietly in the ruins of a family I had allegedly destroyed. One by one, the calls stopped. The Christmas texts dried up. Dani kept calling for a while, but even she got quieter as the months went on. The family drew a line, and most of them stood on one side of it, and I wasn't on that side. The only people who never changed were Grandpa Victor and Donnie, who eventually came around fully, and Oren, who made coffee every morning and never once suggested I should try harder. Grandpa Victor called every Sunday. He never mentioned my parents. He never took sides out loud. He talked about his bees and his bad furniture and the weather in Delridge and what Pepper had destroyed that week and whether the county was going to fix the road at the bottom of his property. He also, once on a Sunday call when I was having a particularly hard week, said this. I'm not worried about you, Selah. I never have been. You've always known where you were going, even when you didn't know you knew. I thought he meant it as encouragement. I would later understand he meant it as something else entirely. A statement of fact. A confirmation of something he had already done. But I didn't know that yet. Grandpa Victor passed away 18 months after the Thanksgiving. He was 81. He went the way he'd done most things, quietly and on his own terms, in his farmhouse in Delridge with Pepper asleep on his feet and his reading glasses on the nightstand beside a book he'd almost finished. Dani called me. I drove to Delridge alone. I held his hand in the funeral home and thanked the air in the room for him. Oren drove up that evening and sat beside me on the farmhouse porch until midnight without saying anything that needed to be said. My parents attended the funeral. We were in the same room for 2 hours. We did not speak. My father nodded at me across the aisle. My mother looked at me once and looked away. Colton sat between them like a dividing wall. I sat with Dani and said goodbye to the only person in my family who had ever made me feel like showing up was worth the effort. His attorney, a kind woman named Miss Okafor who had an office above a hardware store in Delridge, read the will 2 days after the service. The farmhouse and most of the property went to a land conservation trust he'd been a member of for decades. His personal belongings were distributed among various people he'd loved across a long life. His beekeeping equipment went to a neighbor who'd always wanted to learn. Pepper went to Donnie, who was delighted and slightly overwhelmed. To me, he left one thing specifically named. A small parcel of land adjacent to the farmhouse property. 4 acres wooded on 2 sides, with a creek running through the eastern edge. Roughly the size of a large garden. He'd bought it separately from the main farm 20 years earlier, and it had sat as a quiet, unremarkable piece of land that nobody had ever paid much attention to. Miss Okafor mentioned it in the same breath as the beekeeping equipment, like a footnote. She handed me a deed and a sealed envelope. His handwriting was on the front. For Selah. Open when you need a reason to laugh. I didn't open it. Not that day. I tucked the envelope into the inner pocket of my coat and told myself I would open it when I was ready, which is the thing you tell yourself when you know the truth is that you're not ready at all. That envelope lived in the inside pocket of that coat for 14 months. If you've ever kept something sealed because you're not sure you're ready for what's inside, you know exactly the kind of weight that adds up over time. Drop a comment below if you've ever been there. I'd love to know I wasn't the only one carrying a letter longer than I should have. Life moved forward the way it does. Oren and I settled into the kind of ordinary that is actually extraordinary when you pay attention to it. A house with a garden that was losing its battle with the deer. A dog of our own, a large opinionated hound named Fee, who had no respect for property lines or alarm clocks. Friends who came to dinner and stayed too long and nobody minded. Work that mattered even when it was slow. Sundays without the ritual phone call to Del Ridge that still felt like a missing step on a staircase every single week. I kept putting my hand where the railing used to be. 3 years passed, almost to the day. And then, on a Tuesday afternoon in November, I came home from the office to find an envelope on the kitchen counter where Oren had stacked the mail. Plain white, standard business size, printed label, return address I didn't recognize. The law offices of Holt and Brierley, based in the same city where my parents lived. I stared at it for longer than a reasonable person stares at an envelope. Oren came into the kitchen, saw my face, looked at the envelope, and said, "Do you want me to open it?" I said no. I said I'd open it later. Later turned into dinner, then dishes, then the late news. Then Oren asleep and me still at the kitchen table with the envelope in front of me like a chess piece I hadn't decided how to move. I finally opened it at 11:47 p.m. with the house quiet and Fee snoring on the kitchen floor. The letter was 2 paragraphs and 1 attachment. The letter informed me, in professional, measured language, that my parents, Randall and Gloria Voss, were pursuing the transfer of a parcel of land in Del Ridge County that had been left to me by my late grandfather, Victor Aldous Harmon. The attachment was a legal document, a quitclaim deed. There was a line at the bottom for my signature, a 45-day deadline, and a phone number for the office of one Mr. Brierley. I read it 3 times. Then I laughed. Not a small laugh. Not a polite, controlled laugh. A real one. The kind that comes from somewhere below your ribs and has nothing to do with what's funny and everything to do with what's true. I laughed because 3 years. 3 years of silence, of no birthday card, no holiday text, no how are you, no I heard you lost your grandfather and I'm sorry, nothing. 3 years of a story they told everyone else about why I was the problem and they were the suffering party. And the first time they reached out. Not to me, not with their own words, but through a lawyer, through a piece of paper. It was to ask me to hand over the land my grandfather had specifically by name left to me. I laughed because of course it was. Of course that's how they came back. Of course the first sound after 3 years of silence was the sound of their attorney's letterhead. And then I stopped laughing. Because something else occurred to me. Something that made me get up from the table and go to the closet where my winter coat hung on the 3rd hook from the left, the same coat I'd worn to Grandpa Victor's funeral. I reached into the inside pocket. The sealed envelope was still there, slightly softened from 18 months of existing inside fabric, but intact. His handwriting still clear. For Sela. Open when you need a reason to laugh. I'd had my reason. I just hadn't known it yet. I sat on the kitchen floor with my back against the cabinet and opened it. Inside were 2 things. The first was a document. Legal paper, heavier stock, notarized, stamped, with a header that read, Declaration of Beneficial Interest and Restrictive Covenant. Voss Parcel, Del Ridge County. Below it in clean typeface, language that I understood immediately, because I had spent 6 years working in regulatory law, and I had written documents exactly like this one for other people. The parcel of land he'd left me, those 4 acres with the creek, was subject to a restrictive covenant he had filed with the county land registry 8 years before he died. The covenant specified that the land could not be sold, transferred, or otherwise conveyed without the express written consent of the named beneficiary. The named beneficiary was me, and the covenant included a clause that specifically anticipated and nullified any attempt by a third party to compel or pressure the beneficiary into a transfer through legal means. It named no one. It didn't have to. He'd written this 8 years before he died. 8 years before the Thanksgiving dinner. 8 years before the silence. 8 years before the attorney's letter. He had sat in Miss Okafor's office and described my family with a precision I had never been able to manage and built a legal wall around me before I ever knew I needed one. The second item was a single sheet of notebook paper, folded twice. His handwriting, neat and slightly slanted to the left, the way it always was. Sela, I know how your parents see you. I've watched it a long time. This land isn't much, but it's yours, and nobody can change that. Not them, not a lawyer, not a document with a deadline on it. You've always known your value, even when they didn't. I just wanted to make sure the paper agreed. I love you the most. Grandpa V. I stayed on that kitchen floor for a long time. Oren found me there at some point. He didn't ask what happened. He sat down beside me on the tile, looked at the 2 pieces of paper in my hand, and waited. I showed him the covenant document first. He read it slowly. Then he looked at me. And then. And this is the thing I will love him for until I run out of days to love anyone. He didn't say anything for a full minute. He just nodded. Like a man who has been suspecting for a long time that the foundation was stronger than anyone knew and has just found the engineering report that proves it. The next morning, I called Miss Okafor. She had retired the year before, but she answered her personal cell on the second ring. And when I explained why I was calling, she said, "Oh, yes. Victor told me someone might call eventually." He was very specific about what he wanted that document to do. I asked her if the covenant was enforceable. She said, "It was filed, recorded, and has never been challenged. I'd put it up against anything your parents' attorney sends your way." I asked her if she would be willing to speak with me further. She said, "For Victor's granddaughter, absolutely." I called the offices of Holt and Brierly that afternoon and asked to speak with Mr. Brierly directly. His receptionist had the polished, neutral voice of someone trained to sound like no one has ever surprised them. She asked if I was calling to return the signed document. I said I had some questions about the document before I signed anything. A pause. A keyboard. "Mr. Brierly is available Thursday at 2. I said Thursday at 2 worked perfectly. I thanked her and hung up. Then I called Miss Okafor back and asked her to prepare certified copies of the restrictive covenant, the original county filing, and anything else she had in the file. She said she'd have everything ready by Wednesday. I asked if she wanted to be on standby by phone. She said she'd be sitting by it. I spent the next 4 days doing something I hadn't done in a long time. I prepared. Not emotionally. Emotionally, I had been preparing for 3 years. Maybe longer if you count childhood. Maybe longer if you count every cross-country meet where I ran hard and looked for familiar faces at the finish line and found nothing. I prepared the way I prepared regulatory filings. The way I prepared briefings for state agencies that didn't want to hear what I was about to tell them. Facts in rows. Documents in order. Timeline established. Nothing left to anyone else's narrative. I pulled the Delridge County Land Registry records online. I confirmed the covenant's filing date, 8 years prior. I cross-referenced it against the probate records from Grandpa Victor's estate, which Miss Okafor sent me as a PDF Wednesday evening. Everything confirmed what the document said. The parcel had been encumbered before it was ever included in the will. My parents couldn't compel a sale even if a judge agreed to hear the case. And based on the covenant language, getting a judge to hear it would be a long, expensive, and ultimately futile exercise. They didn't know that. They had sent a lawyer without doing the homework. Which, when I thought about my father's approach to most things, confident, unreflective, certain that the shape of reality matched the shape of his expectations, made complete sense.